SPJIMR's Center for Wisdom and Leadership presents its podcast series called Past Imperfect.
You're listening to Past Imperfect, a history podcast brought to you by the Center for Wisdom and Leadership at SPJIMR. I'm Dinyar Patel. Modern Mumbai can seem like an architect's or city planner's worst nightmare. The infrastructure is terrible. The sea and rivers reek of sewage. Millions live in awful slums. The civic government caters to the interests of private automobiles instead of improving mass transportation or simply making the sidewalks pedestrian friendly. Robert Stephens, an architect at RMA Architects in Mumbai, joins me to discuss his new book, Bombay Imagined, which explores unbuilt plans to combat many of these problems. Bombay Imagined demonstrates that many of these problems are not new. For hundreds of years, Bombay citizens have devised plans to clean up sewage and garbage, build proper parks, provide decent living spaces for the average citizen, or build that elusive, walkable sidewalk. There has been no shortage of grand plans, but the willingness to execute them has been remarkably limited. Thank you, Robert, for joining us today. I'd like to begin by asking you a little bit about what drew you to live and work in Mumbai. Now, you've told me that you grew up in South Carolina, in Somerville, and I'm familiar with South Carolina since I lived there for about 5 years and worked at the University of South Carolina. What drew you to leave home and find work and life in a very different environment?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So you're absolutely right. I grew up in South Carolina. I studied at Virginia Tech. I went there when I was 18. And my time at Virginia Tech was very special because, during those 5 years, I met people from all around the world. And South Carolina, as you know, is not exactly the most diverse part of the country. And this was really a fantastic experience. So a large number of friends happened to be from Bombay, from Mumbai. And in 2006, I visited the city with two of those friends. They were traveling home for Christmas break. And I spent 2 weeks in the city, and I loved it. And I still honestly can't pinpoint what it was, but I just kind of fell in love with the city, and I decided I want to work and live in Mumbai. So that was kind of the start. I then went back for my last year of college, started searching for offices where I could see myself contributing. And didn't find anything, nothing that really struck me. And then one day I stumbled upon an article that was written by RMA Architects, who's now my boss, been my boss and colleague for the last 15 years. And the piece he wrote connected with me. And then it said he has a firm, in Mumbai. I researched it and I said, that's it. That's where I'm going to work. So I wrote to him. He was teaching at Michigan at the time. I drove up to Michigan, met him, and he said, basically, like, you're a little bit nuts. And I said, fair enough. He said, let's try. He asked me, how long do you want to work? I said, of course, indefinitely, which I realize in retrospect is a little bit also of a crazy answer, because I wanted to make a career here. And he said, let's try it for 6 months. We tried it and it worked. Here we are 15 years later.
So what was it about Bombay or Mumbai that really attracted and drew you to the city? I mean, what you said you saw it for a little bit when you were in college, and then of course you came back. What factors really kind of made you go ahead?
This is a question that I am struggling to answer myself, especially because during the pandemic, I realized deep down inside I'm an introvert. I actually thrived in isolation, I feel, which is bizarre. Like, why would someone who is, at his core an introvert, find one of the world's most crowded cities, a wonderful place to live? So I don't have all the answers to this question, quite honestly. I think, though, it was this ability to create and to be creative. I found that very exciting, very liberating, because especially my first few years in the city, like I was making furniture for my small PG place, then my rental. I was making art. I was collaborating with artists, and for someone who thrives on art, it was it kind of felt like everything was possible, and I still feel that in many ways today. Mhm.
Working at RMA, what type of projects have you been involved in? I mean, it'd be interesting to give our listeners
Yeah.
some idea of what projects you've been involved in around the city and maybe even across India.
Yeah, yeah. So we're very fortunate that we don't specialize. That we have this really exciting, diverse range of work. So I'll start in the present. Right now we're in the middle of designing and seeing built a crematorium at Worli, which is, as far as I understand, the largest in the city. So phase one is operational now. Phase two is in progress. Of course, we've done a number of institutional buildings at the Prince of Wales Museum in South Bombay, and then across the country. One of my earliest projects. This was in 2008, 2009. Was a corporate office in Hyderabad. But it was very, very exciting, especially it was my second project, that the entire building is kind of encased in greenery. So it had a lot of symbolism, performative, sustainable qualities, but it's also just a really beautiful building. So a wide mix, which keeps everything fresh, and the challenge is kind of new literally every day.
And in addition to architecture, you've also established yourself as an aerial photographer of Bombay
Mm.
and many other cities. What got you interested in that, and how do Indian cities look differently from, say, 50,000
Yeah,
feet above?
yeah. Yeah, yeah. So growing up, I never really flew. We drove everywhere, as you'll recall in the U.S. Flying's a bit of a nightmare. Driving's much more peaceful and predictable. So when I came to India, I remember those moments, that opportunity to fly somewhere. It was like very special. So I was kind of like a kid at the window, staring out the window, and I was just drawn to photograph what I saw, which was, cities of millions below us. Um, and, it began just as this urge to create art, this documentation. And in I think it was 2013, Radhi Parekh, who runs a gallery in South Bombay at Artisans, she said you should exhibit some of these images. And I thought that was quite bizarre because I wasn't like a professional. I was just doing this because I loved it. And we did an exhibition, and that's when I realized, like, visuals of Mumbai, of cities across the country, uh, can be really powerful, for not just art, not for architects, not just for urban planners. People, we love to see our cities in a new light, in a new perspective, and the aerial photography did that. So every flight I take, I'm at the window seat, documenting as much and as artistically as I can.
That's cool, and I can kind of relate to that because I grew up in a small town in California, Bakersfield, where there was really nothing to do. But what I did growing up was go through a lot of aerial photography books by a photographer called Robert Cameron. Maybe
Mm,
you've heard of, who
mm.
had he had composed a number of books of aerial images of cities like San Francisco and Paris and New York, and
Okay,
that was how I kept myself busy
nice.
growing up. So yeah, I'm kind of envious
Lovely.
of the fact that you're able to do that for India.
Yeah. No, it's a great joy and privilege.
So what looks different from that altitude? I mean, what strikes you about Indian cities
Mm.
that might be difficult to notice when we're on the ground?
Yeah, so I say this very carefully. Especially Mumbai, the city looks beautiful from the sky. It looks absolutely beautiful. It looks like, a city by the sea. And when we traverse the city on the ground, when I go from Bandra to Kalagoda for work, one has, for example, no sense that the sea is even remotely close because it's so cut off from daily life, by and large. So you just the area of you gives this kind of all encompassing visual of of not only what the city is, but what it could be. And for some reason, that's just really, really powerful and beautiful.
So I want to turn to your book now. So you've written this book, Bombay Imagined, which looks at about 200 unbuilt projects from about 5 centuries of Bombay or Mumbai's history. What got you interested in this project? I mean, in addition to architecture and photographing cities, you also exploring the history
Yeah.
of Bombay and its unbuilt heritage. What were kind of the
Yeah.
sparks that got you interested in this
Yeah.
project?
Yeah. So, I always loved history. And I never, studied it, never had the chance to study it. I spent all my time in studio and college, for better or worse. But I loved history. And my first few years in the city, about 2007 to 2010, I would walk the streets on the weekends, just walk hours and hours on end. And Mumbai has this very kind of beautiful culture of the footpath booksellers. And I was intrigued because I love history, I love old books, I love cities, and all of these interests collided at these moments. And without any end in mind, I would just browse. I would walk. I would browse these booksellers' collections, and slowly a collection of books kind of evolved, that were these kind of offbeat, rare old books on the city. Um, and slowly, as I started diving into them, I started to discover these ideas, almost utopian ideas for the city, which were, of course, very different than the city that was surrounding us now. And one of them in particular was Arthur Crawford. He had written about and envisioned a 400-acre park at Mahalakshmi, which was actually, he had proposed it on top of the city's first landfill. So it was this very kind of symbolic, taking what was poorly planned waste, making it a beautiful public space. And that project in particular kind of sparked this question of, what else has there been in the city's past that was dreamt of, envisioned, but never realized for whatever reason. And that's where it all began with Arthur Crawford, actually.
So since then, you've been able to build up your own library, and I assume also you conducted a lot of research at other places, right? I mean, just looking through your
Absolutely.
book, yeah, you mentioned.
Yeah.
I think your book mentions maps and visuals from Scotland, the British Library, other places in Bombay and in the US as well.
Yeah. It's about, I think, around 22 or 23 institutions consulted. I would say about half of those I visited in person. The other half, were all virtual interactions, which were surprisingly seamless. In many ways, much easier than physically entering, an archive and going through all the processes that demands. So yeah, a lot of institutes were very generous in sharing material. And Yeah, I think for me that was actually one of the most enjoyable parts of the book, was that process of searching, and researching and digging. It was a great joy.
And probably difficult, I can imagine as well, right? I mean, I've had experience trying to track down maps and visuals in
Mm,
places like the Maharashtra State Archives or the
yeah,
BMC, and more often than not, you either get material that's too damaged
yeah,
to photograph or use, or you just get a bureaucratic hard stop telling you,
yeah,
we
yeah.
don't have it, or it's lost, or someone has stolen it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it was in, especially the state archives. Since you mentioned it, I recall, probably my guess is half of the files one requested just didn't they couldn't be found. Either they were misplaced, or they crumbled over time. Um, but that was actually a gift in some ways, because especially when I was searching for maps and drawings, in these different archives, often they wouldn't exist. And so we actually chose, instead of saying, okay, this project shouldn't be in the book because we don't have a visual, we actually used that as an opportunity to create visuals. I call them speculations. So we basically said, we have some really rich literary content in which someone's describing a scheme, a vision, a plan for the city, but they never produced a drawing, or it didn't survive. So then, using the kind of the raw historical literary data, we created visuals based on archival maps, city contours, city outlines, and really brought these to life, in a visual form. Some for the first time, in history. So that was kind of, we turned that to our advantage, I think, in some ways, and I my analysis is that kind of these speculations resonate the most with readers, especially for those who don't have a background in architecture, urban planning, because they're kind of alive with this fresh energy. So those have been a lot of fun.
Yeah, that makes me recall from your book. You have a visual of this channel, I think, that was proposed across
Mm,
Mahalakshmi in 1720, right? Where,
absolutely,
it's hard to imagine a place where all these 70 or 80-story skyscrapers are now rising. There was a proposal to
absolutely.
just build a canal right through the island. So
And
it's
that's one of my favorite projects in the book, because I think that canal, it was to cut from basically where Haji Ali is, just in front of Haji Ali, across to Mazgaon. I think if that canal had happened, it would have been like the ultimate flood deterrent for the city, because the problem with Bombay is we're basically a bathtub, right? The center of the island's lower than sea level. The edges, kind of the rims of the city are slightly above. So we have this very kind of deficient bathtub effect. And this channel would have basically been a funnel, for the monsoon, for high tides. And I like to think, if that channel had happened, and been and proven to be successful, we would have had more channels cut across the city. So, for example, the island would have become maybe 5 different parcels of land rather than this monolithic bathtub which we have today. So yeah, I fell in love with the Great Channel when I first heard it, and that's when we said we must create a speculation to visualize this idea.
Yeah, it's interesting to explore these alternative possibilities. I mean, in that case, Bombay would have become much more like, say, an Amsterdam or even maybe post Katrina New Orleans, right?
Absolutely. And this in like Venice, for example, this is an idea that has captured the imaginations of many. Jamshed Tata proposed he called it Oriental Venice at Juhu, from Kardanda up to Juhu. It was to be a 500 1-acre plots, all accessed by canals. It wasn't to have a single road. And then Patrick Geddes, a few decades later, he's looking at Back Bay and saying, like, Bombay must go the Venice route. He's saying it will be a losing battle if you try and create these harsh walls at the edge of the city. You must kind of obey nature, his exact words, rather than try and conquer it aggressively. So yeah, it's also interesting to see how these ideas, they kind of recycle over decades, often by people who have never met, but they're just kind of these similar thought processes that play out in these kind of repetitive ideas.
It's also interesting how frequently these people's advice has been ignored, right? I mean,
Yes,
Geddes would probably be
yeah,
turning over in his grave if he saw what's going on in the city right now.
absolutely, yeah.
So again, you've talked about roughly 200 projects, and again, you start right from the beginning of the creation of Bombay, and you go up to 2020 with plans for
Yeah,
redesigning part of the coastal road that's under construction right now.
yeah.
What's the broader significance of studying these unbuilt projects in Bombay, or for that matter,
Mm,
any city?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, this is this. I really like this question because it appeals to the part of me that's actually not an architect. That, like, I actually consider myself an artist first and foremost, who became an architect. Um, and I like to think of studying kind of these failed visions and unbuilt plans. I like to see it as a conversation. In the same way, when you meet someone and you want to get to know them, you converse, you ask about their past, you inquire where they're going in the future. It's like having a conversation with the city, which we're all, in a very intimate relationship with. It's like having that conversation and just getting to know one another in a hopefully meaningful way. And Bombay specifically, I think what has happened for me in this process is I've realized as an individual, Bombay is actually a city of great empathy, and that's, we typically think of the city as being so harsh. You have the rich and the poor and this constant struggle, but it's actually a place where there's been great empathy for centuries. Now, that empathy has not been translated into a physical form, right? This empathy has gone unrealized, but I find a lot of kind of redemptive value in this very idea, because it's so different than the reality we face every day.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think anyone who's been to a place like Bombay and gone to similarly super dense cities like, say, New York will notice that difference, right? I mean, New York has a very hard edge, and over here,
Yeah,
in spite of all the challenges of living and functioning and walking and breathing in the city, people still have a degree of politeness,
absolutely. Yeah,
yeah, and as you say,
absolutely.
empathy towards other people. So, I mean, your book is similar to many other projects or books or schematics that have been done by architects or planners over history for different cities. I mean,
Yeah,
we can think of, like, say, for example, Corbusier, who proposed redesigning Paris as, demolishing the creation of Haussmann and
yeah,
rebuilding the whole city as a collection of skyscrapers in the garden, or
yeah,
even Buckminster Fuller's plan to build a geodesic dome over New York.
yeah.
So, what does this unbuilt legacy of Bombay have in common with unbuilt projects and legacies of other global cities as well?
Hmm. Hmm. What does it have in common? I would actually, what struck me is actually what it doesn't have in common.
Hmm, hmm.
So I'll start with that, because I stumbled upon this really fabulous book, Never Built New York, recently, and it's a brilliant compilation of, also, I think, about 200 unrealized plans. And what struck me between seeing New York's unbuilt past and Bombay's unbuilt past is how much in Bombay we have struggled with basics like sanitation, sewage, water supply, basic housing, basic open spaces. Uh, you know, it's been a constant struggle, and that's where I think the empathy comes in, because it's the residents who have this kind of underpinning of an empathetic nature that says, this doesn't work for a city of millions. You have to have these fundamental essentials for the city to be a pleasant place to live. Um, so I think that's been a big surprise, and for me, like, one of the highlights of learning about these, how water gets into the city, how it leaves the city, how that impacts the oceans, etc. So I think the biggest difference has been that. Um, and then the similarities, I think, especially the last 2 decades, the similarities are very strong in the sense of the pressure of land values. How the very pressure of land values and the, the, the the financial markets drive so many decisions, as opposed to what Claude Batley called the joy of living. The joy of living is one kind of value, and then the rupee is another value. And I think, especially in the last, not even 20, maybe 30, 40 years, you see this stark imbalance between those two value systems that have arisen.
Hmm, hmm. So you talked a little bit about how these fundamentals have not been resolved, and I think that's the one thing that really will strike any reader of your book, in the sense that today we gripe about certain things, right? I mean, a lack of affordable housing, terrible problems with sewage disposal, as anyone who knows who walks
Yeah,
by the coast,
yeah,
lack of open space, terrible, awful infrastructure. I often tell people that the sidewalks here are more difficult to walk than trails I've been on in the Sierra Nevadas, close by to where I grew up. But
yeah.
what your book really shows is that these problems have been around for centuries, right? I mean,
Hmm.
100
Yeah,
years ago, 150 years ago, people were still complaining that Lovegroves was was a smelly cesspit of
Yeah.
sewage,
Yeah.
and it still is today. And um,
Yeah.
what do you think explains the persistence of these problems, and the complete inability of people
Yeah.
in charge to solve these, as you said, fundamental problems with basic
Yeah.
infrastructure?
Yeah, the Lovegrove question is an interesting one. So, of course, Lovegrove, located near Worli, it's kind of the bottom of the bathtub of Bombay. Traditionally, that was the site where the open town drain was at its lowest. Residents at the time called that like a gigantic monster. It smelled so bad, and it was just, yeah, it was very tenacious monster.
And it still
Um,
does. I
and
mean,
it still does.
it
It
smells
still
terrible.
does. Exactly. Yeah. Absolutely. And so now, whenever I'm in Worli, like I think of the last 200 years, in the sense that this has been a consistent problem. And the one thing you learn is, of course, no matter how a city changes, if a fundamental problem doesn't get solved, it will not just go away. And Lovegrove's a great example. But more than that itself, what kind of I've learned in this process, especially of the Worldly sanitation question, is how this impacts other other things. So, for example, I am Kadri, a very well known Bombay based architect. In the '60s, proposed a Hilton hotel at
Right.
Worli, made beautiful drawings. And all of the drawings have one thing in common. You see in the foreground the coastline, you see the western foreshore. And it was to be this kind of idyllic, scenic hotel by the bay, by the sea. And from what I researched, all the drawings were done. They were ready to start construction. A few American executives came, stood on site, inhaled, and said, "No way we can create a hotel here." And the project stopped because it was just, it was not a pleasant place to be. So, and I'm sure there have been many other kind of collateral effects of these basics not having been taken care of, that have been to the city's loss. Yeah.
Yeah, in many ways, I mean, Bombay's problem is well, it's different, and it's both not different from what other cities have faced. I mean, I guess, I mean, there's a reason why no one went to the Thames in London, right, before Joseph
Mm,
Bazalgette built his sewer, or why New
mm,
York really did not have an active waterfront promenade in many places because of
mm.
people, realizing that the East River or the Hudson River was terribly smelly. And you have the
Yeah.
same situation here, or you have the same situation in other cities like Delhi, where people are building over nalas
Yeah.
because they just smell so much.
That's right. Yeah.
But it's just so weird that here, I mean, again, for over 100 years, people have proposed so many ideas, and some brilliant ideas, some ideas that were quite wacky, and
Yeah.
yet the inability to do something like build a proper wastewater treatment plant at your,
Yeah.
as you mentioned, the bottom of the bathtub, the
Yeah.
smelliest, worst place, just has completely eluded civic
Yeah,
authorities here.
and I'll tell you, like, what really has struck me as a big missed opportunity in this question. In 1939, N.V. Modak, he's basically been kind of lost, by and large, lost to Bombay's common history.
Yeah.
But he was deeply engaged in city affairs, cared deeply for the city. He actually, in the early 1930s, he traveled to 76 different cities around the world, um, just to study their sewage treatment plants. And this was all on with municipal funding. It was part of his official responsibility. He came back, wrote a 300-page report, and then said, "At Love Grove, we need this very detailed, elaborate sewage treatment system: primary, secondary, tertiary treatment. Then water can be let into the ocean, without being harmful to human or aquatic life." And that was it. Like, he had done all the research, he had the technical knowledge for this proposal, and basically, uh, it was decided the land was too valuable, that the land should be used not for sewage treatment. And the World Bank came in and helped sponsor two underground tunnels that kind of chucked essentially raw sewage about 3 or 4 kilometers into the Arabian Sea. So, that's also like a very unfortunate funding, I think, because it kind of propagated what I personally feel is not a responsible, sewage treatment system. Um, and so Modric was very he was way ahead of his time in this realm of sewage treatment. And today, you look at today in the last 3-4 years, there have been immense reports about the water around the city being the most polluted seawater in the world. And
It's terrible.
it's
Yeah.
absolutely, you're basically, when I see people swimming at Juhu Chowpatty or at Girgaon Chowpatty, I feel bad because they're basically swimming in sewage.
Sewage
So
and trash. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. So it's a big issue, but Modric for me was one of those empathetic highlights of history in this scenario.
And correct me if I'm wrong. That wastewater treatment plant at Lovegrove is still planned to being built, right? Is,
Uh, so there's something in the works. Every few years, I read they're planning to upgrade it, make it. There are multiple plans at the moment. I believe 15,000 crores worth of work is planned at 7 different STPs. Um, but as far as I can tell, it's not been completed. And what I've learned from the book, until it's completed, it doesn't matter.
yeah.
In the sense of actually having an impact in our day to day lives.
I think there's something to be said about anyone who's a historian of Bombay or anyone who investigates Bombay's history has to really get well versed in two or three things. I mean, sewage, trash, and I guess the other part of the triangle is disease.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And speaking of disease, that just because you've said it, um, this is where Arthur Crawford, right, his 400-acre park. Uh, when I started researching Crawford, I realized like he was a really really imaginative man, and one of his ideas, he looked at the crowded inner city. He said there's lots of disease. We have thousands of people dying every month just from basic waterborne diseases, and he said we need a good ventilation system for the old city. We need to move air through the crowded lanes. So he said, let's cut. He actually proposed this. It's a real thing. He said, let's cut tunnels through Malabar Hill, through Kumbala Hill, through Worli Hill, cut them all at different angles, these big tunnels, and they'll function like these jets. So the southwest breeze was to go like jets through these tunnels and kind of blast, the by lanes of the old city, the inner city, and he thought that would be a way to cleanse, disease from our crowded mists. Very interesting idea.
Yeah, fantastic missed opportunity in many
Yeah, yeah,
ways. I mean, it would have been quite fantastic to explore tunnels built
yeah,
through some of the poshest parts of Bombay today.
yeah.
So I mean, speaking of these interesting characters who made some rather creative proposals, um, you know, I'm thinking in particular of one figure, William Walker, who
Mm,
struck me as being
yeah.
really one of the most creative figures, right? In the sense that
Yes.
he had this quite fantastical plan for disposing of the dead. I
Yes.
wonder if you could tell us a little bit about a person like him. People who, I mean, people
Yeah.
have heard of Arthur Crawford.
Yeah.
Some people have heard of Modoc.
Yeah.
Others have definitely heard of people like Charles Correa
Sure.
or others who are involved in Bombay's history. But Walker
Yeah.
is someone I'd never even heard of Walker myself.
Yeah.
So can you tell us more about people like him and specifically what this plan
Yeah.
was that he had for disposing of the dead?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I actually dedicated the book to William Walker, because even though he was very prolific in his writings, I have a gut feeling he was also an introvert, because you don't hear much, about him outside of his writings. So I consider William Walker. He came to Bombay first came in 1820. He literally was in transit, so he didn't stay. He came back in 1845, stayed for 2 decades. Um, and I consider him the city's first foreign, environmentally minded civic activist. I think what we call like a sustainability pundit. I think at his core, that's what he was about. He was about using resources as efficiently as possible, in, as you said, creative ways, and all for the purpose of just making the day-to-day life of common citizens more pleasant, right? Um, he wrote prolifically. He was constantly, his articles were constantly, in the daily newspapers, letters to the editors. And one of his schemes, I think there's about 8 in the book. One of his schemes he calls luminous cremation. And he looks at what's happening in the city, and he says, every day we have about 20 bodies that are being cremated, and it's kind of a wasteful process in his analysis. So he comes up with this idea. He says, let's capture the gases generated during cremation. Let's funnel these gases, through a pipe system across the city, and use this to light the street lamps. And the way he writes about it is so poetic. He's like a secret kind of a hiding poet, because he talks about the symbolism that even though our friend has passed into darkness, he's shedding light into this world still in his memory. So very beautiful writings. And I spent weeks thinking, like, why would William Walker make this proposal, to light the streets? And then one day, I woke up one day and it kind of dawned on me, like, because he was a walker, and I love humor, so that's a joke. That's why he was trying to light the streets for his own benefit. He was a walker, William Walker.
And I mean, he had this quite incredible quote where he says, "What I mean, it'd be much better for those who passed away to illuminate the city rather than, I think, what, form clay to cover a bunghole."
Exactly. Yeah.
Some of his language is quite evocative in many ways.
Totally. Yeah.
So there are people in your book like Walker who are less known, but there are also in many ways people who are very well known, right? Who feature in your book. I mean, people like the British architect George Gilbert Scott, or Patrick Geddes, who we've talked about, the great Scottish planner, or even Corbusier.
Great.
So, what is the reason these people were drawn to Bombay? I mean, someone of global significance being drawn to a city like here, and that continues to today, right? You've shown how Foster and Associates, Foster and Partners have been designing things over here, or how Zaha Hadid had proposed plans over here. What do these individuals' engagement with Bombay tell us about these architects?
Yeah. So I think I've been thinking a lot about this, and Scott is, of course, in the 1840s. Someone like Zaha Hadid, Foster and Partners, is 2020s. So I've realized I think there's this kind of inherent draw of the creative opportunity of the city, which is also what I think attracted me in the early 2000s. So I think that's one aspect, this inherent opportunity, inherent creative draw. And the second is, I just think, because being the financial capital, I think there's been opportunity here. There's just been perhaps more opportunities for creation than there have been in other cities, many of which have been historically harder to get to. Bombay was, of course, the most direct, especially from Europe. It's kind of the first stop through the Suez Canal. So I think it was this combination of in some sense, ease of access, opportunity, and then that kind of mystical creative potential that exists in the city. I think it's this kind of combination.
It's also remarkable how many of these architects' plans flopped, right? I mean, you said G.R.D. Tata, disapproved of Corbusier's attempts to design the Air India Tower.
Yes. Yeah, it's I think this is one of the most unfortunate things about Mumbai is the number of plans that we have let pass. And it's not, the city in its current state is not the way it is because we have a lack of creative ideas, right? There's a whole plethora of reasons why, it is the way it is. But I think this also speaks to the limitations of design per se. We as architects and urban planners, we often kind of think that we're the boss. Like, we set the stage on how cities develop. We're just a very small cog in the wheel, and I think Mumbai is a wake up call to that reality. And whether it should be that way, I of course won't speculate on, but that's the reality. And until that reality is addressed, the city will continue as it is now.
On that topic, what do you think is the biggest missed opportunity Bombay has had in terms of its unbuilt heritage?
Hmm. So I think it's actually two in combination, two or three actually. So I spoke a little bit about Captain Johnson's plan to cut that channel from Haji Ali to Mahalakshmi. I actually think that was a big miss because it dealt with Bombay's fundamental geographic struggle of the bathtub, right? So I think that was the beginning. So just let's assume for a minute that happens, right? That the channels cut, more channels get cut. The second big miss, I think, was actually it was a very subtle proposal. Claude Batley proposed it over lunch at a Rotarian meet in the 40s. And he said, Bombay is too dense. It's too dense for its own good. It needs to kind of split into 25 coastal townships. And 2 decades later, Charles Correa, Shirish Patel, and Pravina Mehta said Bombay needs a twin city. Batley said 2 decades earlier, he said we need 25. We need to split into 25 coastal cities. And I think, Captain Johnson's cuts from the 1720s would have aided in that process. It would have created these manageable parcels of land. And then assume for a second Johnson's cuts happen, Batley's explosion into 25 coastal townships happens. Then I think the last missed opportunity was actually a plan by Ajit Bhattacharjee. He was resident editor, Times of India, who said there should be no private cars in the island city. Everyone should travel by public transport. And I love that because you see the amount of conflict and environmental impact that private car use and ownership has had and is having in the city. I think that combined with the other two gestures would have absolutely transformed into a city we wouldn't recognize today.
It'd be completely unimaginable in many ways, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
just think about how we live every day with car horns blaring through our windows, and not having
yeah,
that in at least the island city would have been
yeah.
quite transformative. So, I mean, that's a good way to kind of transition on to one other topic, which is contemporary planning in the
Mm,
city, and some of the projects you discussed from, say, like the 80s onward.
mm,
And it's quite telling that while Bombay has gone on a frenzy of constructing flyovers or expressways or things like the Sea Link,
mm,
or other car-centric infrastructure,
yeah,
many of the unbuilt projects you document in the last part of your book have revolved around making things better for pedestrians or for improving
yes,
mass transportation.
yeah.
Why is the civic government, or the state government for that matter, here so beholden to the automobile? I mean,
Mm,
to the point where, I mean, we have many countries around, many cities around the world, even in developing countries,
yeah,
which have moved towards more pedestrian-friendly infrastructure. And places like Mumbai, I mean, as well as many other cities in India, have kind of bucked the trend and said, no, I mean, the automobile is supreme, and
yeah.
how dare the pedestrians say anything? What explains this fundamental disconnect between the reality of everyone who's a pedestrian,
Yeah.
and the primacy of a few thousand rich people who have their private car?
Yeah. Whew. I honestly don't know if I can answer that, why that is, without sounding like I'm judging. Um, it's all I can say is whenever the pedestrian has been prioritized, the pedestrian has lost. It's been a losing proposition. And, if you look at, for example, the work of Charles Correa, the work of George Whitted, and a lot of contemporary architects practicing now. Take Correa and Whitted especially. They were prolific in their work, especially in realizing their work um, when it had a private angle. Or no, that's not the right word. That we'll have to edit out. They were prolific, especially of course with private clients, and they were prolific when there was some kind of commercial aspect to their work. The components of their projects that prioritize the pedestrian, whether it was gardens or pedestrian promenades, those were often just cut. They were just cut and outright ignored. And I don't know if it's just because the pressure on land values in the city, or just a mismatch of values in the decision making authorities. But you see this over decades. You see it when there's British administration. You see it post independence. So it spans this gamut of leadership in every respect. But this constant kind of bypassing of the pedestrian and a prioritization of machine based infrastructure. Um, and I struggle to understand why that's the case. And maybe that's, I don't know, this was a good research project to know why these decisions have been taken exactly. But it's of course to the city's loss, because it is, as you said, extremely hard to just move through the city as a pedestrian on the number 11 bus walking.
Yeah, I mean, right before the pandemic, I think there was an initiative to kind of redesign streetscapes. I mean, I remember outside
Yeah,
BMC, for example, there was a plan to kind of make it more pedestrian friendly, and it looks like many of those plans just completely flopped, right? I mean,
they
I went.
flopped. Yeah. Absolutely. There was a competition in, I think, 2018 or 19. One of the shortlisted entries is in the book. And it was to kind of reimagine MS Ali Road, through the heart of central Mumbai. And, the one thing about architects, typically, of course, not always the case, but typically, we put our heart into what we do. And a lot of fabulous entries, rethinking streets, making them user friendly, making them appropriate for every walk of life. And the project, it just, as you said, it just flopped. And there's a lot of publicity often that competitions being held, this is going to happen. But then when it comes time to implement, just I don't know if it's the layers of bureaucracy, multiple agencies involved, which has historically been a big problem in the city. But when it comes time to make that final decision that says, yes, we're going to do this, things just fall apart. And it's consistent. You see it over centuries. They just fall apart at that decision making point. And then before you know it, someone's been transferred or the government's fallen, there's new government, and everything starts over again. So,
That's true. Yeah, I mean, it is in many ways a historical continuity, right? I mean, as early as the 1860s, right? I mean, people were trying to monetize Back Bay for commercial reasons rather than, to try to
yeah,
reclaim land for public space. But yeah,
yeah,
it is striking. I mean, just how many things that would be for the benefit of all just completely fall by the wayside in the planning process. And you look at a
yeah,
map of Bombay. I used to work at the Nehru Center in Worli for some time, and the library there has this wonderful, huge satellite picture of by PK Das and Associates of
yeah,
Bombay with kind of color coded for land use. And I used to, because I was good at procrastinating from writing, I used to go and stare at that for quite a long period of time, and I'd be
yeah.
struck by how much land there is in the city and just how badly managed it is. I mean,
Yes.
why is the airport authorities of India sitting on Juhu Aerodrome
Yeah.
when that
Yeah.
could be a park, right? Or why is the
Yeah.
railways sitting on so much land in Parel when that could be a
Yeah.
park? It's
Yeah.
incredible.
Yeah. And this Juhu question you brought up, in 2014, a Bandra-based firm made this proposal. They said the Juhu Aerodrome should be a 385-acre park. And they prepared a whole scheme for managing Juhu Tata road traffic. And of course, nothing happened. And it just, I write about it in the book. There were similar improvement plans in the late 1920s. And a resident of Juhu at that time said, the problem is we have too many authorities kind of mixed up in this one space, and nobody will make a decision. And it's just been this constant frustration. And this question of multiple authorities, multiple decision makers, which ultimately leads to no decisions being taken. This is what in 1945 a communications panel was formed to evolve the city's road transport, right? And it's a very interesting story because they, of course, it's like a 20-member committee. They have dozens of meetings. They make this elaborate map, a road section, all the pedestrian, cars, slow moving, fast moving. They make this elaborate set of drawings. But then they say the most important part of this proposal is that we must conglomerate all of the authorities into one agency who will make decisions regarding transportation in the city. And if we don't do that, basically all of these drawings and schemes are essentially useless. Um, and of course, that didn't happen, and this is still a huge complaint today that many planners and people engaged in the city's issues have. That you have all these agencies. Sometimes they talk, sometimes they don't talk to each other, and it's just like having multiple brains brainstorming without doing it together.
Yeah, in many ways. I mean, again, it's not dissimilar from many cities, right? But other cities have been able to do it. I mean, one thinks of Robert Caro's book on Robert Moses, the power
Mm,
broker in New York, where Robert Moses is this great and somewhat infamous city planner from New York,
mm,
came across a city with multiple overlapping jurisdictions, and just because he was a very good legal mind, he was able to kind of sidestep and acquire land and was able to do stuff that was for the very good of the city of New York, but ultimately also for the very bad. So I mean, it's a
yeah,
mixed blessing of some sort that
yeah,
Bombay has this impenetrable bureaucracy that prevents grand plans from being built.
yes, that's well put, actually. Yes.
So, I mean, one unbuilt plan that you mentioned in the book is, of course, something that I think many people would be very familiar with: the Korea Committee plan for redeveloping the mill lands, and of course,
Yes,
now we have the Eastern Waterfront, which is
yes,
also, as you mentioned in the book. I mean, it's been taken up by HCP, the controversial firm from Ahmedabad, which has been
yes,
involved in many things in the Modi government. And
yes.
there's been also speculation about whether this plan would also kind of be eventually, bought out by commercial interests, and Bombay would lose
Mm,
another potential project for
yeah.
opening up its coastal waterways.
Mm.
What do you think is the likelihood of public space being prioritized in some of these future projects? I mean, you mentioned kind of this Shiv Sena sponsored city park for Mahalakshmi, or, for
Mm.
example, even the Eastern Waterfront. I mean, will the public get what it deserves, or will we just get more of the same?
So I will just go on historical data and say the odds are very slim. And if it happens, it will be an anomaly. If these public spaces remain available, of course, we'll be delighted if they are. It will be a historical anomaly. Um, and time will tell, of course. So I don't want to pass judgment, but one has to be very cautious, cautiously optimistic. With both the Eastern waterfront and the Western waterfront, that's of course well under construction
Yeah.
now. So I think in that sense, we will have to see.
How do you envision your book, Bombay Imagined, fitting into a larger conversation about making Bombay a better place in which to live or breathe, for that matter?
So what struck me, and this was completely unexpected. The number of people who say the book has made them smile.
Hmm.
Like I love that, and I of course never had any expectations how people would react to it, but the constant feedback is that the book has made them smile, and I can't quite figure out what that is, why that is, but I like it, and for me the sense is it's this realization that kind of in some ways the city's not as bad as it seems. That it still, even though it seems in many at times as if it's kind of heartless and cold as a physical place, that heart is still very dense and there. um, uh, so I hope it continues to do that. I think it's a pleasant surprise that as we get to know the city better, in its many forms, even if it's the unbuilt forms, it brings that sense of joy, and that again I keep coming back to that word, that it is a city of empathy, even if that empathy has not been translated into a physical environment. And I think that's critical. I think that it will continue to come up in the future, and hopefully the results change, that we actually see these empathy-based projects being realized. um, uh, and I personally find that a very hopeful aspiration.
So as we conclude, I want to ask you what current projects are you working on? Whether they're a part of RMA's firm, if you're able to disclose that, or other investigations you're making into Bombay's built and unbuilt heritage.
Yeah. So the RMA, I think the most exciting is, of course, the crematorium I mentioned earlier. And I always think of William Walker when I go to site. Just, this, how do you create spaces that are meaningful, at that moment of death. So that's, of course, ongoing. At a personal level, I've just started compiling 10 years of aerial photographs on the city. Because especially 2013 to 2023, there's been a very dramatic transformation in the physical form of the city, of course, and you see basically the middle lands have kind of evaporated into skyscrapers, and I think the aerial perspective kind of puts that across very clearly and very powerfully. So compiling a book of that, and then kind of long-term plan is a book on Ahmedabad. In exploring Patrick Getty's time there, looking at the city walls and how the city walls have evolved, how they've been demolished, how they've been retained, the whole story of the city walls in that 600-year-old urban center.
Yeah, Geddes is a fascinating figure and someone who I wish more Indian planners, especially those in the government, would rediscover. I mean, in many ways, he correct me if I'm wrong, he kind of sidestepped grand plans and said, just work with what you have, right? And integrate.
Yes. Yeah. The challenge with Geddes, no government liked him. Nobody, no, because he was on the ground, he was propagating small scale, just very different than our business as usual forms of growth. So very organic growth, one could say. So
yeah, kind of the anti-Hafiz contractor in some ways, right? I mean, you probably wouldn't look too grandly upon.
Hafiz is also complex. So and I think the book reveals that in interesting ways. Yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah. So one a few last things I'd want to talk about. I mean, as someone I share with you this kind of the status of having one foot in India, one foot in the United States. What strikes you about commuting back and forth, especially to a place like Somerville in South Carolina? You go. I mean, I've not been to Somerville, but I've passed through it many a time on the way to Charleston, and it's very different from the maximum city. What is the transition like for you between these two places that you call home?
Gosh, end with the most difficult question. So, I mean, of course, the density. It's a Bombay mega dense city. Somerville's the extreme opposite of that. But I just, it's kind of maybe a bit of a cliche answer, but I think being surrounded by people, especially people who create with their hands, I find very, very inspiring. And for some reason, when I go to Somerville, I just don't see that. I don't see creators as much as one sees, in a place like Mumbai. And I think that's maybe the creative impulse in me that then gravitates constantly back to the mega city.
Yeah, for about 5 years or so, I'd commute back and forth between Columbia, South Carolina, and here. And obviously, as someone who's not an architect, I won't have that perspective. But I'd be just struck by, how things stayed the same in Colombia. Maybe one restaurant had opened or one restaurant then closed. And whenever I'd come back to Bombay after a few months, a new skyscraper was here, or an old building which I really liked is no longer there. The pace of change is quite dramatic. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the last thing I, of course, have to ask you as someone with a background in South Carolina is, have you had any luck finding good barbecue here? Or do you have any opinions of what is your favorite barbecue in South Carolina? Anyone with South Carolina heritage has to, of course, talk about barbecue.
So I will deeply disappoint you because I'm not a barbecue fan. I'm just not. I'm very sorry.
How is that possible?
I know. It's bizarre, no? I guess I'm an oddball, so I will deeply disappoint you.
Fair enough. Well, thank you, Robert, for being here. It's been great to talk to you, and we look forward to seeing your future work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dinyar. Thank you.
You were listening to Past Imperfect, a special podcast series by SPJIMR, brought to you by SPJIMR's Center for Wisdom and Leadership, produced by Vinita Dwivedi.